Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another Total War Warhammer 2 tier list, and this time around we are going to be covering the forces of the Beastmen based on some of the requests in earlier videos. And right now we've got a whole bunch lined up for the next few weeks since you guys seem to enjoy this content and have been pitching all your suggestions, so I'm kind of trying to go through and cover each of them in turn. But Beastmen were requested, and this is probably going to be a bit of a shorter video because Beastmen are one of the smallest factions in game when it comes to unit variety and composition. They're also one of the most they're one of the most incomplete rosters in the game as well. They are missing multiple units, lords, heroes, and unit variations from the tabletop, and this has been a huge point of contention. I'm sure many of you know that things like the Jabberslythe and Gorgon are complained about and demanded on the regular, but for good or ill, this is the situation we have. The Beastmen are definitely a pretty small roster, and so we'll dive right in and start with the figurehead of the faction. Definitely the sort of defining Beastman, and that's old One Eye, Khazrak One Eye, and he's a lord who's been a bit of a meme pick for a while. I do believe that lately he has kind of bounced back a bit. He's gotten some steady buffs, though generally they're relatively small ones. And perhaps the most serious point of contention with him has always been the black mail, or the dark mail, and this was a pure garbage item for the longest time. It was only a magic resist that only worked when he was in melee, and it was just such a garbage item. It's still not a very good item. Nowadays, it does give him some armor though, so it has made it slightly more appealing. Unfortunately, though, Khazrak's item is not the greatest. He does, however, have Vanguard deployment. Perhaps one of his other big weaknesses is the fact that he's only got two options for kit. You either bring him on foot or you bring him on a chariot. So if he's on foot, obviously he doesn't really bring anything to the table. He's not great at killing stuff because he's a foot lord. Foot lords, as we all know, are a bit weak. For foot combat lords, to be specific. He doesn't have sort of AoE buffs. He's only got the Scourge, which buffs him, gives him some crazy melee stats and poison, but doesn't really help the nearby troops. He does have Apocalyptic Visions, which is a nifty buff, but doesn't last long enough, really. And if you put him on the chariot, he does mulch infantry like no tomorrow. He's incredibly powerful that way, but it does make him an easy target for big flyers, monsters, that sort of thing. As Beastmen, you really don't want your lord getting sniped out, so it makes it difficult to use him. So he's going to get a C tier here. Khazrak, perhaps if Dark Mail is buffed finally to a point where it's reliably makes him tanky, maybe he'll climb a bit in the rankings here, but until then, he's a very niche pick. You bring him with a handful of Vanguard builds, or as a bit of a surprise pick. He's not bad to the point that you can't make him work, or that he's not doesn't have at least some niche, but definitely I think he's somewhere between C, hovering towards D tier. I actually might even put him in D. Definitely most of the Beastmen lords are not very appealing, and while Khazrak can definitely get value, and I'm sure you guys have seen him use him on a few occasions, I just don't think he generates that much. Next up, we do have Morghur Shadowgave, and this guy's an easy S tier. Beastmen have huge issues with leadership, keeping their lords and heroes alive, and more specifically, of course, the lords, because you can't afford to lose your leadership. Beastmen Infantry and Cavalry has terrible leadership values at baseline. This is somewhat compensated for with Primal Fury, but nowhere near enough, really. So the only stable units that don't rout easily are Minotaurs. And if Minotaurs don't get screened by infantry, they're screwed. So you need Morghur. You need your lord to survive. Morghur is the best bet for that because he's got massive missile resist of 75%. He's got some limited magic resist. He's got regeneration, insanely high HP at over 4,000 on large settings. He applies poison and melee, which once again makes him tankier. He still can be sniped out and all that, but being a foot lord, so he gets knocked around. Having that poison, having that regen, having that high HP pool makes him very tanky. He also has some really good items. Of course, he can summon Chaos Spawn, which is nice. He can also transform an enemy unit into Chaos Spawn, taking away the last 20% of its HP. Used to be a targetable spell, and back then he was probably like an S+ tier. He was really insane. Now it just triggers on the nearest 20% or below HP enemy unit, which usually means it affects chaff, but it's still a cool ability. Still makes Morghur very useful. And honestly, even if he lost his Chaos Spawn summons, I believe personally that Morghur would still be an S tier lord for the Beastmen, because the fact that he's survivable is so critical for the faction. Finally, we have the third and last legendary lord for the Beastmen, and that is Malagor the Dark Omen. And this guy, a few patches back, we'd probably have moved in the one time that Morghur was not the only alpha dog. Perhaps Morghur would have been A tier at one point and alongside Malagor. But Malagor, after the nerf to the Cygor, his ability as a Cygor spammer has definitely been reduced. The peel there has definitely dropped. He is still a cheap lord with magic, which is nifty, and I think makes him a little bit more useful than Khazrak, though not by much. Cygor summons, though, not really that great for chip damage anymore, the way they were. Malagor also suffers from having essentially bipolar, sort of a bipolar kit. On one hand, he's this squishy foot-bound caster who really can't fight worth a damn. On the flip side, he's got all these short-ranged leadership buff and debuff items that would imply he should be closer to the front line. Unfortunately, you can't really do that. You can't make use of those items. So much like Khazrak, he suffers from some items that just don't really pan out the way you'd like. And so I think he's definitely nowadays C tier. Lore of Wild, not bad. I think people underestimated a good bit. But ultimately, I just don't see Malagor as being a sort of top dog with the nerfs to the Cygor summons. Still viable, still decent in certain cases, don't get me wrong. I find him enjoyable every now and then. But, though personally, I probably find him less enjoyable than Khazrak, even though I think he's a bit more competitive. Finally, we do have the Beastlord, and the Beastlord is actually going to make C tier. Some of you guys might be surprised by this, but I think that because he does get Apocalyptic Visions as well as the Horn of the First Beast, he has much more utility. You can combo him with a blob of, well, with a Minobus, a mob of Centaurs, that sort of thing. Throw him on a chariot, he pushes in with them, he provides that AoE melee attack buff, makes your units much more potent in a short burst. He can also help Bestigors that way, units like that. And this, in my mind, makes the Beastlord a little more useful than Khazrak. It's a tiny bit better than the Vanguard on Khazrak, in my opinion. And just most importantly, that item is just nifty. The Horn of the First Beast, definitely useful. Still not the most competitive lord, but I do think he warrants a C tier, just above Khazrak here. I was debating him and Malagor being closer to B tier, but ultimately I think C is where both of them land. For heroes, and this might come as a bit of a surprise, I'm actually going to give the Bray Shaman A tier. Now, a lot of people do complain about this guy being pretty easy to snipe, and he definitely has limited mount options, plus limited lords. So why do I rate him so highly? Well, first of all, you do get the Jagged Dagger, which helps your Winds of Magic regen. Second of all, he's pretty damn cheap. Third of all, the lords you do get are generally decent. Plus, you have to bring, as the Beastman, because you're almost always bringing Morghur as your lord, and otherwise, well, 3 out of your 4 lord choices are non-casters. You're almost always going to bring this guy, so he's kind of almost mandatory. And finally, the Chariot Mount in this guy is really friggin' good. You can bring a stripped down caster with literally no magic, just put him on a chariot, and you've got an insanely cheap AP heroic chariot that can mulch infantry for days. You can bring like 2 of these guys against a lot of factions, have like 1 spell on each, so you've essentially got a reserve caster if your opponent snipes one out, and go ham. They're in my opinion, very, very good. Their chariot is very strong. You don't have the greatest mount selection otherwise. It's not like you can make him fighty or make him escape super well. Chariots are definitely a bit clumsy. But ultimately, I really do enjoy the casters. I think they're very strong. One of my favorite casters in the game, in fact. Just because of how cheap and effective they are with those chariot mounts. Even though they don't have alternate mount options. And some of you guys might disagree with this assessment, but I do think it's actually... I do find that the Bray Shamans are essentially more attractive, especially within the Beastmen roster, but even when compared to other casters, they just bring so much utility to the table compared to something like, say, a Damsel for Bretonnia, who's ultimately just a lady on a horse. So that's my 2 cents there on why he makes A tier, in fact. Next up is Big Papa Gorbel. Back in the days of Warhammer 1, he was probably an easy S tier with Potion of Toughness and just insane combat stats, all that good stuff. But he's fallen a long way since then. Known for getting punted around like a ragdoll, and it's called Flyable, is literally a meme. Gorbel, bit of a sad state for a while, was probably an F or D tier. Lately, with some mass buffs and some slight improvements to his stats, he has climbed up out of the gutter a little bit. I still don't find him that useful, though. Generally, if you need to deal with large, he still doesn't really have the mass to plow through and get at those large targets you want him beating up on. He does have armor, which is nice, but generally I find that a squad of Minotaurs with shields will do you better. The Gorbel's definitely a bit on the pricey side of things. And while he does have some nice buffs, debuffs, he can get an item that grants him terror, the Axe of Men, make himself temporarily unbreakable, that sort of thing. He's not necessarily atrocious, but also not great. And I would put him at C tier, because you can make him work. I just generally find that he's outvalued by Minotaurs, especially Minotaurs with shields. And yeah, so he just lands a C tier. Definitely can be used as a bit of a surprise pick, but ultimately he's just not that good at what he's meant to be good at, and still gets punted around surprisingly often. I think he has a few niche matchups where he does relatively well, like Bretonia, but by and large, I think he's not worth bringing over another squad of minnows. Which does bring us out of the Lords and Heroes. There's not much to say here. There's only 6 of them in total. So yeah, we're right on to Infantry. And for Beastmen, the Infantry is a bit of a mixed bag. First and foremost, we do have Ungor Spearmen. Now these guys are going to make A tier. Not so much because I'm that fond of the unit. It's a pretty trash spear unit. It's one of the worst in the game. I think it's one of the worst chaff units in the game in general. But it is mobile, so it can be used for backline harass. It does have charge defense against large, so you can use it to break up enemy cavalry and support Minotaurs. They're pretty nippy. They're quick on their feet. They're cheap. Unfortunately, they don't get Vanguard, which is a little stupid. But if you're going to try to go wide, if you're going to try to sort of get additional width as the Beastmen, these guys are generally the way you're going to go. And so I think that they make an A tier just for that. And after talking about the Ray Shaman and putting him in A tier, it might sound a little weird, but I just because these guys are the cheapest infantry, and they are the way you're most likely going to go if you're just trying to swarm your opponent, they are going to make an A tier here. They're maybe A to B tier. They're definitely... I might give them a B tier. Maybe that's a little more fair, but I do think they are leaning towards A tier just because of how common they are with the roster, with the faction. You almost always bring a few units of Ungor Spears. Even against factions where you wouldn't expect it, just because they're so cheap and efficient at encircling and disrupting enemies. Which does bring us to their Shielded Brethren, who... they're alright. We'll put them in B tier, because I think a lot of these units are a bit tied. So Ungor Spears with shields, you will occasionally, if you've got a bit more gold left over, you might run these guys. They still don't Vanguard, which sucks. Makes it they don't. That's one of the big problems. Beastmen have a few specific builds. One is a straight up rush, another's a Vanguard rush, and then there's the Sigor builds. And you can't really Vanguard rush with the Ungor Spears, which sucks. It makes it difficult to use them as a support tool there, and definitely reduces their viability in my opinion. And the ones with the shields are definitely, they are 50 gold more expensive, so oftentimes you might not want them. But I think a B tier. Ultimately, these are the most common width-enhancing units you're going to bring. They're the third Ungor unit, or the third Ungor infantry unit. Ungor Raiders, the vanilla variant. These guys are more expensive, and I actually would rate these guys as a C tier. There's a few niche matchups where you might want to bring these guys, but they're basically goblins that have Vanguard and no silver shields. And then you get Sock. I guess maybe the closer comparison would be like Night Goblins without poison, or silver shields. Unfortunately, that's not really the greatest thing ever. They can be used to disrupt backlines and harass in a handful of matchups, like specifically Dwarves really is the one that comes to mind. But because they don't have anti-large, they don't have that charge defense, they tend to get run over by any sort of cavalry. They rout very easily, and I just don't find that they're... If you want to enhance the width of your army, you're going to bring Ungor Spears. You are not going to bring normal Ungors the vast majority of the time. Because they're just more expensive. They're not really that good against large, which you're usually a bit worried about. And while they do Vanguard, they just don't kill stuff in melee very well. Like against Dwarves, you just bring them to harass backlines and disrupt Slayers, really. And that's about it. Which does bring us up to the mid-tier Beastmen Infantry. We do have the Morghur with shields. These guys, in my mind, do make an A tier. They're a very solid unit. High mobility, bronze shields, decent offensive stats, decent defensive stats. The only real disadvantage to them, they Vanguard as well. The only real disadvantage to them is the fact that They are very squishy, and their leadership is not the greatest. But by Beastman standards, or infantry and cavalry standards, it's pretty normal. But they definitely can rout pretty easily. But they do hold up better than their dual wielding brethren. The Vanguard makes them synergize really nicely. They can get up in their opponent's face and crump them good. Obviously, you won't bring them in every matchup, but I do think that if you're, as far as the mainline infantry goes, if you're looking for if you're looking to do an infantry build and you're looking for mainline infantry as Beastmen, these will be your go-to. Ungor spears are something used to supplement a monster heavy or cavalry heavy build. Ungors are something used to supplement any build or a handful of builds as a flanking force. Bestigors, a bit of a niche unit. And Gors with dual wielding are a bit of a niche unit, but it's the Gors with the shields that really are your mainstay infantry. It's kind of like Eternal Guard, or can be for or the High Elves spears. They are pretty standard, in my opinion, standard fare. Which does bring us on to their dual wielding brothers or cousins. These guys definitely not so good. Probably a C tier. There's a lot of C tier units here. Unfortunately, but these guys, yes, they vanguard, yes, they can do a good amount of damage. They're very offensive oriented, but they have no shields, which makes them stupid susceptible to missile damage. They are squishier than Gors with shields, so ultimately, oftentimes they'll take an exorbitant amount of damage from various enemies. It's not like they get AP. They do more damage for sure, but they don't get AP or anything, so it's not like they're great against units that a Gor is not necessarily great against. They also cost more than the Gors, making them a bit of an inefficient mainline choice. It's something, these guys are something you bring as a supplement. Once again, just like you bring a handful of Ungors to flank your opponent, you might bring like 1 or 2 Gors to supplement your Gors with shields to punch through a specific area of line, especially with a Vanguard build against, like, say, Empire or something. You throw these guys at a particular unit that you want to crush quick, and that's where you throw your Gors to bust through. But it's not sort of a mainstay unit you're going to use as your main line. Which does bring us on to Bestigors. At one point, these guys would have probably been an A tier. They've gotten some nerfs, and some of the metas kind of shifted around, I feel, with the Beastmen. Nowadays, I would probably put them at B tier. They're not quite as common or as standard as the Gors. If you do want to go for an elite build, you will probably you might bring Bestigors. They do have the best leadership as far as your infantry goes. Not that saying very much. They do have AP, massive charge bonus, very high mobility for a great weapon infantry. If these guys punch through the enemy front line, they will overrun any shooting they have in a matter of seconds. It's not even a like the speed with which Bestigors can overrun a backline is disgusting and terrifying. Obviously, they're practically mandatory in some matchups, like against dwarves, for example. I feel like you almost have to bring these guys. That said, I think there's a lot of matches where you just won't bring these guys because they're a very aggressive damage-oriented unit, but usually you're going to be looking to get your damage from other sources, like a Cygor, like your Centigors or your Minotaurs. And Bestigors aren't really like an anchor unit. They're not a sort of core mainline unit. It's something you use more as a supplement, except for a handful of like Bestigor heavy build or rushes. So against like dwarves, for example. But ultimately, I just don't feel like you're going to use these guys that often. You might bring like 1 or 2 of them as an augment or a supplement unitary unit. But against a lot of the factions that might bring heavily armored troops, you're often going to need something different. For example, against Dark Elves, before, these guys used to be much more useful because Dark Elves didn't have Sisters of Slaughter, but Sisters of Slaughter have kind of thrown these guys up for into a bit of a mess. Bestigors can't take on Sisters of Slaughter, really. They're decent against Empire, but ultimately they don't trade the greatest into greatswords. And greatswords are a common choice just because they beat down all the cheaper Empire or Beastmen infantry. So once again, do you really want these guys, or do you want to say bring Centigors with great weapons to break up the Empire cav and then deal with the greatswords later? That sort of thing. So Bestigors, while definitely potent, having potential, and being a very strong unit in the right circumstances, I think do net a B tier. next up, that I guess moves us onto the Regiments of Renown. We got 3 units of those. First and foremost, the Destroyers of Drakewald. I do believe these guys deserve an A tier. I just think they are one of those staple units. I don't think they're quite S tier. They are a pretty pricey spear unit. They cost by Beastman standards. They cost 600 gold. They do have poison, which is nice. But ultimately, and they definitely are strong. They can definitely act. They're essentially a better support tool. They're more stable because they've got better leadership. They're just a better supporting Ungor spearmen with shields. And so if you combine them with another unit, they can often do exceedingly well. That said, they're definitely a bit pricey, so they can't really... It's more difficult to use these guys to swarm. You are essentially paying... You could get 2 Ungor spears for these guys. So I do think they're a pretty standard pick. I also think it's worth keeping in mind that you're not always best off with them, and sometimes you're just not going to run them. And while they might be more common than Ungor spears or Ungor spears with shields, they still have those limitations. Black Orange Ravagers, on the other hand, I think are probably pretty S tier. If you're going to bring Gorherd with shields, you're probably going to bring Black Orange Ravagers. They've got a little more armor. They've got, which actually, I say a little more armor. They've got 35 versus 15 armor, which is over double compared to what the normal Gorherd have. They're immune to vigor loss, and if I remember correctly, they've got immunity to psychology, like a full immunity to psychology, rather than the augmented Primal Fury one. They also have, I believe, do these guys have stock? I believe they also have stock. These guys are just really solid overall. If you're doing a Vanguard build, you're going to run these guys. Generally, if you need a cheap, even if you're going with a cheap, say, Ungor heavy build to support your monsters, there's a good chance you're going to bring Black Orange Ravagers anyway as a support tool. And they're just so much more difficult to break than standard Beastmen Infantry. They've got respectable melee defense because they are the shield variant. Once again, they're pretty mobile. They can overwhelm enemy units, get into the back lines, do a lot of disruption. I just love Black Orange Ravagers. They're a very solid unit. And I just think they do eke out Gorherd with shields a little bit because they're such a staple even in matches where you wouldn't necessarily bring Gorherd. Even against Dwarves, for example, against Dwarves, when I play, I normally don't bring Gors. I'll normally roll with Vestigors or a monster heavy build with some cheap trash. But I often find myself bringing Black Orange Ravagers in that matchup because they will, say, mince through Slayers. They're just a very strong unit. Which does bring us to Korok's Man-Rippers, and these guys are another S tier. Vestigors with anti-large, monsters melee defense, so I believe it's 44, which Beastmen don't have many well-defending units. Most of their units have pretty trash melee stats in general, and especially melee defense. So these guys have really good melee defense. They've got very high leadership for a Vestigor because they've got our Chevron 9 or their Veterancy 9. Anti-large with AP, which is a huge issue for Beastmen. It's dealing with armored monsters. These guys give you some fighting chance. They're very mobile because they are Vestigor based, so ultimately it's a lot like having a unit of Slayers with armor, is what these guys sometimes feel like. And they're such a good anchor unit. Once again, you'll often use them even when you wouldn't use Vestigors, just because they're such a critical unit. They fulfill a role that Beastmen really struggle to fulfill. And so I think they're making an easy S tier. Which does get us into the massive overloaded category of foot skirmishers with Ungor Raiders. This unit, a bit difficult for me. I used them, I find myself using them a decent amount, but ultimately I think they're probably a C tier. The reason here is probably C, leaning towards D tier. They can be used offensively. They can Vanguard. They've got stock. Which makes them somewhat survivable, makes them capable of getting into position. That said, their range is really bad. Their leadership is really bad. Their AP values are basically non-existent, so they don't really help Beastmen counter a lot of the trouble units Beastmen struggle with. A long-range skirmish cav or skirmishers in general, these guys won't really help against that because they get outranged by every foot skirmisher in the game. They get matched or outranged by multiple skirmish cavalry in the game, and their range is so short that oftentimes if your opponent, for example, starts wailing on your front line with pistoliers or something, these guys will still not be able, will have still have to advance to get into range if there's, like, say 30 meters of separation between them and the unit being shot. Against the Lyrian Reavers or Well-Micred Glade Riders or units like that, these guys will do nothing. essentially. And I think that that's a big part of the reason for why in many matchups you see Beastmen rely on Cygors to deal with these enemy skirmishers, because Ungor Raiders and of course Centaurs with throwing axes don't cut the mustard there. They still do have a little bit of a niche. They can definitely whittle down and harass enemy troops, especially lightly armored enemy troops. But when push comes to shove, you're not going to run them all that often. I think they're definitely lower C running into D tier. Because generally, plus defending them is often a chore. Like you could instead bring more cavalry if you're trying to, say, get into a backline. And if you're worried about monsters, these guys are not going to help you against the vast majority of monsters. They're not going to help you against like a Vargul from Mortis Engine, because they'll just get shut down because their range is so short. And they don't have AP to help against big, heavily armored monsters. And as Beastmen, you don't have access to armor sundering tools, really. You've got Soul Blight. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else you have as Beastmen. I think that's it. You got Soul Blight. That's like your... Oh, and you got the Withering on the Lore of Shadows. So if you bring 2 casters and focus a unit, you can drop its armor by 60, but you're not doing that. Let's be honest here. So, ultimately, Ungor Raiders just don't counter the units Beastmen need countered. And there's a little bit of an extra sort of oomph tool. They can apply missile damage to an enemy unit, which helps it route faster. But that's kind of it, unfortunately. I just don't see them as being much else than a nuisance. It's definitely C towards D tier. Which would bring us into the cavalry department. And first, well, yeah, we'll include the hounds in the war beasts and monsters category. But here we don't have, there isn't too much honestly in the cavalry category. Again, Centaurs, the vanilla variant. In my mind, these guys probably a B tier. They're a very solid Vanguard unit that's relatively cheap, incredibly mobile. You've got 95 speed when your trait is active, which I think a lot of people don't realize when they just look at the raw stats. But with Primal Instincts, you're up to 95 speed, which makes them the fastest light cav in the game, essentially, alongside Glade Riders. You stack that on top of Bronze Shield, not great, but workable melee stats, and an immunity to Vigor as long as their leadership stays high with Rowdy. And these guys are definitely a solid unit. Against lightly armored factions, these guys can swarm, they can disrupt backlines, they can overwhelm units. Against Wood Elves, for example, you can like double tap Wild Riders with these guys. They only cost 700, keep in mind. So you can easily bring like this unit, or you can bring 2 of these guys almost for a Wild Rider. Or bring one of them, or like you can have a Vanguard build where it'll be like 2 Centaurs with spears and a Poison Warhound, and that's still, or 2 Poison Warhounds even, and that's like the cost that a Wood Elf player pays for 2 Wild Riders with shields, and you can swarm them and demolish them with that sort of composition. So, and you can just there's such a good swarm unit. So against squishy factions, they're very solid. The problem is that against more heavily armored factions, they definitely do struggle. Against greenskins, they can be okay. Obviously, in the mirror match, which you don't, obviously mirror matches in this game are kind of rare, but they can do well there. Against Vampire Coast, decent backline harass, because they do have better leadership than Hounds, so they don't route super easily. By Beastman standards, kind of. The Beastman leadership sucks. But yeah, Wood Elves, like I mentioned, they're very solid there. And they can be used as a sort of niche filler unit in a handful of matchups, just to get a little more. You can oftentimes have these guys as a supplementary unit for your great weapons, where your great weapons will take on the enemy heavy cav, and in the meantime, these guys can flank around, get into the back line, and destroy enemy rear troops. And yeah, they're just decent overall. But definitely not up to snuff with great weapons, who are going to make an A tier here. I think these guys, back when they had Splash and were a bit more busted, they would have might have been S tier. Now, the AP stacked on top of units like, say, Poison Warhounds makes them pretty potent against factions that rely on mid-tier heavy cav. They can trade very effectively in those situations because they only cost 900 gold. A bit like Boar Boy Big Guns, really, is what it boils down to. Once again, they're very mobile, so they can flex around very quickly. If you're looking to, if you decide, essentially with these guys, you decide the pace or the location of a fight. Your opponent doesn't get to decide that most of the time. And while there are matches where you just won't bring these guys and you won't rely on them, most of the time it's these guys will definitely I think in most matchups these guys will definitely perform. They can help shut down dragons if your opponents are trying to dive bomb your backline. One issue for these guys is definitely the fact that they can't pursue monsters on top of, say, halberds. There are spears. They're just very flimsy. But if, for example, your opponent tries to dive bomb your backline or some units with a dragon, these guys can surround him and beat him down, chase him off, especially with hounds. They'll do very well there. And it can be a potent force on the battlefield. And definitely, I think, a bit more potent, or a bit more consistently powerful than normal Centaurs with just spears. The next unit on the roster, of course, is the Regiment of Renown, Sons of Goros. And this unit, it's going to make A tier, though it's definitely a bit of a rough one. So Sons of Goros get more armor over normal Centaurs, which is nice. They've got 70 rather than 35 armor. They do have magic damage, which is incredibly rare, and that's really the main thing bumping them up here. They've got magic damage, which, because of how rare it is in the Beastmen roster, bumps them up to A tier. In fact, if they didn't have magic damage, I would have probably put them below Centaurs for ranking, because at that point, they're just too expensive to justify most of the time. But having passable armor and having magic damage to help the Beastmen against some really tough physically resistant units does, in my mind, bump these guys a bit. The main problem with them is that they are paying for Guardian, which is effectively useless since most Beastmen lords are slow. Morghur, which is the most common pick, is on foot. Malagor is on foot. Your chariot-mounted lords are still not actually fast, and Gorbulls and whatnot are still not fast enough to keep up with Centaurs. So you're either going to be holding these guys back, or and plus you're probably running a suboptimal lord in that choice, or you're just not sticking with those units. And so Guardian is just a wasted trait on these guys, essentially. I think if they didn't have magic damage, I would probably put them at B tier, maybe even C tier, because magic does mean that in matchups where you might face ethereal or high physical resist units, like for example Dark Elves with their with the Slaanesha's Harvesters and the Doomfire Warlocks, it makes these guys have a very powerful niche there. But in general, I actually would rate them below Centaurs with great weapons, because they're just too expensive most of the time for what they deliver. These guys are 1250, normal Centaurs sitting at 900, so you're paying 350 more. That's almost a Warhound. So that's a Ungor Spear with shields, for example, that you could use to support your guys or something like that. And so I just generally don't find them that useful, but they will make A tier here just because they bring magic damage to the field. That armor can occasionally come in handy against like Empire, but against Reichsguard Knights of the Blazing Sun, that sort of thing. But definitely not the greatest unit, even though they will make A tier. And it's one of those things with these tier lists. Oftentimes you got to keep in mind just how much a unit's roster determines its value rather than its own characteristics. Because the Beastmen have so few sources of magic damage, these guys are up a lot higher than they should be, probably. If Beastmen had, say, even just like a cheap magic, if they had like Lore of Fire to imbue their troops with magic damage, these guys would probably instantly drop to like B or C tier, in my mind. But yeah, it keeps them afloat. They're sitting at A. Next up, we do have Centaurs with throwing axes, and these guys are also going to make A tier. Some of you guys might be arguing that they're S tier because they're your primary counter to big monsters. And that might be right. I definitely would say they're A tier, leaning towards S tier. It's a bit difficult for me to gauge exactly where I would put them. On one hand, I do want to put them into S tier. At the same time, I do feel like they are very pricey for what they do. They cost 800 gold. So compared to like Marauder Horsemen with throwing axes, who only cost 600, that is expensive. Paying 800 for a unit like that, it's rough, and they are still very susceptible to enemy missile pressure. They don't have very short range. They don't have shields like Marauder Horsemen with throwing axes, for that matter, and that does make these guys less appealing in my mind, even though they're so critical in some matchups. Like you need these guys, or you at least want to bring a few of these guys into matchups like, say, Lizardmen or Tomb Kings to help pressure those constructs, to help your other counter unit, which is Minotaurs, deal with them. So I think that they do make an A tier. That said, there are definitely quite a few matchups where they're just not worth it because you just don't. Well, I say that, and even against Wood Elves, you often bring these guys to counter tree men because these guys are probably your best bet against trees. So especially if you're trying to do like a Vanguard rush and you don't want to bring Minotaurs. Maybe I'll give them S tier. They're a very strong unit for sure, and definitely critical in some matchups. But it is a bit of a tough call for me, in my mind. S to A tier. Next up, we do have monsters, and we're going to start with hounds. Normal hounds, well, they're hounds. They can disrupt, they can harass, they're cheap. They cost 400 gold. They have Vanguard, unlike the Chaos Warhounds, which is nice. That said, generally, in my mind, you want Warhounds with poison because they have more utility. So these guys are going to drop to C tier. They're not a bad unit, honestly. They're just a cheap throwaway trash unit. But I think that in most cases when you're trying to do backline harass, you're going to bring Poison Warhounds, which in my mind make A tier. Because they give you more control. They help your Centaurs trade better into Heavy Cav. Because that poison effect helps so much. You drop enemy leadership or enemy damage output by 20%. Makes your Centaurs much more tankier, much more enduring. And helps a whole bunch there. Also helps if you, so because Centaurs are so quick, these guys synergize really well with Centaurs. You can snare a unit. You say you catch Wild Riders, like especially against Wild Riders, for example. You start in a Vanguard, you catch a Wild Rider out with these guys. Now the Wild Riders have to stay and fight. Now your Centaurs are in. Wild Riders are never escaping. They're screwed. And that is really potent there. I think puts them at A tier. Next up, we do have the Baconators. These guys, a few patches back, would have probably been D tier in my mind, or maybe an F tier. But lately I've been doing some testing with them, and I would probably put them at C tier, in fact. They're a very cheap AP unit that you could just throw at an enemy and expect it to perform. They're not amazing, but it's weird because the unit is not that great, but it's just so cheap, and it brings a lot of AP damage to the field. You got 18 models there with fairly high HP at 4,400. You pay 600 for them. They have 50, I believe, or 52 weapon strength, and it's AP. So the DPS is not bad on these bad boys. They're reasonably survivable. Pretty quick. They have over 70 speed, if I remember correctly. So definitely not like Squigs who are slow. Yeah, they'd probably make a C tier. Like Rampage cripples them a good bit. If they didn't have Rampage and they cost 700, they'd actually probably move up to like B or A tier as a super cheap source of AP. But because they do have Rampage, it holds them back, and I think locks them into C tier. And actually, I forgot when I was doing Cavalry, and we do have the Baconator, the Razorgore Chariot. This guy is going to make B tier. The main reason being is that, well, it's a pretty damn solid chariot, in my opinion, one of the better chariots, if not definitely one of the better chariots in the game. It's pretty mobile, has AP. It's really the most important factors there. I do find that a lot of times you're just going to bring, you get your chariot needs fulfilled with your Bray Shamans, who are much cheaper to bring. You can get, like I said, you can bring a stripped down one for 700 gold as opposed to 1100 for Baconator chariots. And that's really the main thing there, really. And as Beastmen, your biggest problem, or the most crucial factor, is going to be dealing with enemy flyers and dealing with enemy monsters most of the time. So you ultimately are not going to bring too many units to counter infantry, because you're probably going to win that fight anyway. You need hybrid units that can deal with infantry to some extent, but especially with enemy monsters. It's not like Empire, for example, where like you've got guns and demigriffs and Karl Franz on Deathclaw and all this other stuff that crumps monsters good. You don't have that as Beastmen. So monster countering is the most important part usually, and because of that, in my mind, Razorgores do fall off a little bit, because usually if you're making a choice between more anti-lar or anti-monster versus more anti-infantry, you're often just going to cut these guys, and these are not going to make the cut except against like dwarves. Going back to monsters though, Harpies, these ladies are pretty awesome. I would actually put them at A tier for the Beastmen. One of your only flyers, and your other flyers trash. It's the friggin' Feral Manticore. I have very little respect for that unit. But okay, so it's one of your only flyers. It's relatively cheap, can disrupt backlines, can chase off flying skirmishers, like for example gyrocopters, pretty effectively. One of the big problems for the Beastmen is that they don't have good counters to flying spam. Like for example, Hawk Riders can bully you really well. Though to be honest, you probably don't want to bring these guys against Wood Elves, because Wood Elves will mince you up if they bring any sort of air force. But a lot of flying stuff. Dark Elf, trying to think. The Dark Elf Raven Heralds, for example, Dwarf Gyrocopters, units like that can bully you a lot as Beastmen if you're not prepared, because your ground missiles are too short ranged and too inaccurate to do a lot against them. Like Ungor Raiders have terrible range and no AP, so gyros especially would just shrug you off and laugh in your face. Same thing with and Centigore's throwing axes don't have good accuracy, so while they do have AP, they're probably not hitting very often. And it's not like you can afford to bring a bajillion of them against dwarves. So if your opponent brings a bunch of gyros, you could be screwed. And in that situation, the harpies really do perform, because they can shut down and just chase those units. Even if they don't catch them, spending the entire game running away from harpies is a cost-efficient trade. So I just really like harpies. Next up, we do have the Feral Manticore, I believe, if we go by cost. And that guy's an F tier. I occasionally see people use them. I can't remember the last time I've seen this unit used effectively outside of the summoned version, which is alright, I will admit, because it's just so cheap. It causes terror. But the actual version, 800 gold for a flyer with terrible survivability and rampage. It's like a double whammy of badness. You get shot by anything, you're probably routing immediately. I've had games where I had like Goblin Skirmish Cav shoot these guys. Or my Goblin Skirmish Cav shoot these guys, they come down to the ground level and immediately get gutted by like some second-rate infantry unit because they're stupid and rampage. Really not a fan of Manticores. They're not getting up above F tier in my mind. If you want cheap terror, you bring Lord of Beasts and you drop a Manticore summon, or you bring like Malagor and hell, you cough up that extra bit gold. Nowadays, the Cygor summon's a lot cheaper. You summon that in your enemy's line, get terror that way. You bring a Gorbel with Axe of Men. There are far better ways to get terror on the... You bring the Butchers of Kalkengard, who are an S tier. There are far better ways to get terror on the field than a friggin' Manticore, which is just, no, in my mind, just not a good unit whatsoever. If you only bring this if you're memeing, in my opinion. It also doesn't help that Beastmen don't have good tools to support the air fight. So while Harpies are throwaway, and that makes them acceptable in the air, against factions that don't have the greatest air presence, like the Dawi, like the... orcs, that sort of thing. A Manticore is an much more expensive investment. Using it as a simple throwaway is not really the way to go. And it does cost 200 more than Harpies, and it just doesn't do that much damage. I'm sorry, it just doesn't cut it. Next up, we do have Chaos Spawn. These guys, I'll give them a D tier. I don't think Chaos Spawn are very good, but I think in the Beastman case, where in the Chaos case, normal Spawn are basically completely worthless. I think in the case of Beastmen, they have a little bit of a niche because they apply poison. And they are unbreakable on a roster that has very bad leadership. So I will give them a D tier. That's probably being a bit generous. I'm honestly not sure they're as competitive as Khazrak, who I put in D tier. But I do think they're a little bit better. And once again, the main thing they counter is infantry, which you're not generally that concerned about with Beastmen. You're more concerned about monsters. But I do think they aren't F tier. I think they can be used, and there are a handful of niche builds where you can get value out of them. Which does bring us on to Minotaurs, and you guys might not like some of what I say here, but first of all, vanilla Minotaurs are going to make D tier. And you guys might be shocked, you might be surprised that I'm being so harsh, but vanilla Minotaurs are honestly pretty potato. The unit is very flimsy. As I mentioned before, as Beastmen, zoning out Skirmishers is not the easiest thing ever because you get outranged by everything. Minotaurs are very squishy. They get dumpstered on the charge by much of the enemy heavy cav. They are expensive. 1,250 gold off the top of my head. Or is it 1,200 nowadays? They're still, whatever it is, they're just too expensive for what they provide. They're not terrible in a straight-up fight once it's sustained combat with their AP. They have okay leadership. The problem is, if you're going to bring Minotaurs, cough up the gold and bring shields. Or, I don't like great weapons either, or bring great weapons. Either way, the vanilla Minotaurs just, in my opinion, have few, if any, matchups where you really want to bring these guys. And the thing is, if you're paying for these guys, you now have a lot less gold to backline harass. So the fact that they don't have shields and they have less armor than, say, shielded Minotaurs is a huge downside. And you guys might not agree with me there, but that is just my take. It's why they get D tier. There's not a single build with Beastmen. Not a single matchup where I would bring Minotaurs with dual wielding axes over normal Minotaurs. In fact, these guys are probably over Minotaurs with shields. And it might sound harsh, but Yeah, I just wouldn't. I think you can make them work. I definitely think they're more workable than Feral Manticores. They're less of a meme tier pick, just because they have potency if they make it into combat. But yeah, for their price, I just wouldn't bring them. Manticore or Minotaurs with shields though, who are the next up on the money count, or an easy A tier. Silver shields, more armor, very solid melee defense. I believe 46 baseline on these guys is nuts. The shields compensate for what's basically the classic weakness of Minotaurs, which is ranged fire. And they do have a little more armor, which makes them a tiny bit more tanky against enemy heavy cav, like non-AP heavy cav, that sort of thing. They're just a great unit overall. They're like the core unit of a Minotaur boss. You bring like 2 or 3 of these guys, or like 2 of them, and like the Butchers of Kalkengard against a lot of factions, and you can basically just roll over them in a big old minnow blob and just crush everything in your path, drive them before you, and hear the lamentations of their women. Like they're really, really strong. I love the Minotaurs. They don't make 8 S tier though, because that spot is reserved for the Butchers of Kalkengard. There are a few matches where you probably wouldn't bring Minotaurs with shields. To be honest, not many. They are pretty damn good. One thing I will also mention is that if you're worried about enemy large, and you might be thinking, well, Minotaurs with great weapons, and I actually should put them up there before the Regiments of Renown, but I got a little ahead of myself, which is so good. But if you're going to be dealing with enemy large, these guys are often better just because they're more survivable, so they'll actually stick around to fight that large for you. And if you just need to deal with that large, you hit them with an enfeebling foe or something and bring them down to size. Make your Minotaurs that little bit more effective. Or hit them with like a Mantle of Korok or something. I find that a much more reliable way of countering big nasty stuff than trying to make Minotaurs with the great weapons work against large stuff. But yeah, either way, normal Minotaurs with shields make an A tier. They are definitely still squishy against enemy heavy cav if it gets the full clean charge on them. If they get surrounded by enemy skirmishers, they can definitely suffer because they don't have shields on their back. Obviously, it's not missile resistant, just shielding. But still, very solid unit. Butchers of Kalkengard, they've got regen, they've got terror. They're insane. Such a strong unit. They've got like 60 melee defense. This unit is nuts on so many levels. Very good sort of high mass defensive unit. Very good offensively, can really line break for you, and just such a good unit. Finally, Minotaur out of the Minotaur pack here. Minotaurs with great weapons. These guys are C tier, and I know I can already hear people complaining and disagreeing here, but Minotaurs are so popular with great weapons. You see them all the time. Yeah, you do, but in my opinion, they're not a good pick. I've had a lot of actually interesting discussions about this with some other players as well as YouTubers, and many people are not fond of Minotaurs with great weapons. You see them used often, I feel, in replays, but when it comes to sheer competitive value that they bring to the table, their flimsiness, their susceptibility to ranged fire, plus their low melee defense, the fact they can get charged down pretty effectively, and their high cost, does in my mind make them a less reliable choice than Minotaurs with shields if you need to deal with big monsters. Let's be honest, if you're worried about, like, let's say you're worried about Dark Elf dragons or High Elf dragons, they're probably bringing like Blackheart Corsairs to shoot the crap out of you, or they're bringing Illyrian Reavers to shoot the crap out of you. If you're worried about, like, even like if you need to deal with like Kolek or Shaggus, Chaos can still bring skirmishers. They often will, because they're going to be worried about your Centaurs with throwing axes. And now you've got these Minotaurs who are easy fodder for them. Against Lizardmen, where you might think they'd be good, well, against Lizardmen, you've got Chameleon Skinks. You have Pterodons. You have the Skink Chiefs, all of which might very well spend the entire game wailing on you from above, whittling you down. And that lack of shields, that low armor, it hurts. It adds up. It makes this unit very painful and very difficult, in my opinion, to really gain value. Against Empire, they'll probably have Free Company and Pistoliers who are going to beat the crap out of you. Want to counter tree men? What else are going to shoot you to death? You're much better off with the silver shields. they're just such a risky pick in many matchups. Like, if you knew your opponent wasn't bringing cheap AP missiles, maybe they'd be worth it. But because your opponent probably is going to bring cheap non-AP missiles, these guys fall apart. And while I do think they're more useful than the normal Minotaurs, because there are a handful of niche situations where you can make them work and get good value against monsters with them, I just don't find them super appealing. Next up, we do have the Giant. This guy, probably also D tier. Giant's just not very good. He doesn't synergize well with Beastmen because he's not an aggressive choice. He's too slow to really keep up with the Beastmen mob if you're trying to advance quickly. You can't Vanguard. So if you go for a cheap rush build like that, he can't support you. He's very susceptible to the standard counters to Beastmen, like cheap and non-AP missiles, or cheap non-AP units in general. So he doesn't like bring a unique strength to the field. He can be used a little bit in, say, the Vampire Count matchup, the zone away Mortis engines, but that's honestly the only match where I can see myself using a Giant as the Beastmen. Most other matchups, even against, say, Chaos or something, counter Shaggoths, I'd much rather kite him and pick him apart with throwing axes and chariots and that sort of thing. Which does bring us on to Cygors. I think a normal Cygor... So Summon Cygor has been nerfed a bunch. The normal Cygor didn't get buffs through its accuracy, though, to compensate. It can, however, force your enemy to come to you. So pretty solid unit. Probably a B tier. And then the Eye of Morsley is probably an A tier. Both are definitely a bit niche. You're not going to bring him every time. But Eye of Morsley does have that nifty net. It's pretty accurate. You can definitely whittle down enemy heavy. You can basically whittle down any multi-model unit, except like your Royal Hippogriff Knights with them. Or maybe like Monstrous Infantry. But besides that, Cygors will do pretty well against everything. Demigriffs, Heavy Cav, Infantry, you name it. They'll crump it. And they can provide you with a little bit of an anchor against big monsters if push comes to shove, because they, while not being on par with, say, a Giant for combat stats, do have some staying power, especially just because they have a lot of mass in their single entity. So Cygors, in my opinion, the normal one's a B tier. It's just not that accurate. So it's a bit unreliable, but it can still force your enemy to advance. Which oftentimes can screw with your opponent, because your opponent will expect an aggressive build with Beastmen, and instead then they get this campy thing, and oftentimes their build isn't optimized to fight that. Eye of Morsley enhances that by being more accurate and having a net. So that's just my 2 cents there. That's where I'd put it. And that's the Beastmen roster for you guys. There honestly wasn't that much to cover. It's a pretty small roster. There just aren't that many units. But that's where I'd put everything. I think the only one here that I'm kind of hesitant about now, in hindsight, is Khazrak. Maybe I'd bump him up and be nice and put him up to C tier. Because honestly, I find him more useful than Chaos Spawn, Minotaurs, and the Giant. When it comes to Beastmen. I just don't feel that either Malagor or the Beastlord deserve B tier. But I definitely would separate Khazrak from these guys. I just think... Yeah... He's better than these 3 units. But, yeah, that's my take there. I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it entertaining and fun. If you don't agree, or if you do agree, or have your own thoughts, opinions, be sure to share them. I honestly love to... I always love to hear what you guys have to say. Oftentimes, you guys disagree with some of my statements, and that's fine. It's interesting. Some people have just... a lot of it comes down to playstyle, and sometimes you can find a unit that someone thinks is bad, can be made to work with a certain approach, and that's perfectly fine. That's how the game is. There's a lot of viable options, for sure. So be sure to let me know what you guys think down below. I'd love to hear it. And that is going to be it for this video. Wyvern out.